So now, with our next panel, we leave the world of measurement and numbers, and we go back to some marketing evergreens, and we talk about the 360 mobile marketing mix. And this panel will be conducted by Katie Manning, Global Product Director from Adjust. Hello. How are you?
Hi, everyone. We're really excited to be here today for Mobile Spree, beautiful venue. So I wanted to start it off with a quick question. Who here has ever seen a Got Milk ad? Okay, Got Milk, right? The Got Milk mustache? Milk mustache? Anybody? Okay, we got some around here. Now, if you've seen a Got Milk ad, have you ever had a direct response ad about a Got Milk ad? Right? Immediately go and do something or be able to track it. Anybody? No, but you still remember it, right? It still resonated with you. Somehow your synapses fired, you got excited, and it went into your memory, and now you know Got Milk. So that's what we're here to talk about today, right? I think that this entire day we've been talking about measurement and measuring everything, right? From push notifications to paid advertising, direct response. But so what we want to talk about on this panel is balancing that, right? How can you not do just direct response, but also bring back in some of that traditional advertising, right? So some of that brand equity that we know actually really matters. So I've got some people on the panel here today who actually have quite a bit of experience when it comes to not only direct response, but also going into branding. So if we can just do a round robins here, introducing yourself.
Sure. Thanks a lot. I'm Marvin, head of marketing at Ada Health, Berlin-based health startup, mainly focusing on online marketing, but in the last couple of months we also been doing some offline stuff, what I will talk about later.
Hi, I'm Thomas. I work for 8Fit, also a Berlin-based app in the fitness space, and I have pretty much a direct response background, and we're just transitioning to doing more stuff, so I hope I'll also learn myself today in this panel.
My name is Aras. I'm the head of marketing and operations for Netmarble, EMEA, which is a gaming company from Korea.
Hey guys, my name is Jim. I work as a senior brand manager at Babbel's in-house brand and creative services agency, and super thrilled to be here today.
So we're going to start it off with the best and the worst thing about direct response advertising. And Thomas, since you actually are still doing a lot more direct response, if you could start us off.
I guess for me, like the best part of being able to track everything is you get the feedback immediately, like very fast. You've got a feeling how your campaigns are running. If this is going to be a complete disaster, you can shut it off early. So how fast the response is really something that is enjoyable as a marketer, for sure. The bad part, I would probably say that if you shut it off, it's gone. Like you're not building for the future, so you also like develop a dependency to it. It's kind of you develop an addiction to it. If you're aware of this addiction, maybe it's fine, but that's the bad part.
Marvin?
I think a great thing about it is that you limit uncertainty because you know you're in control of it. There are a lot of screws you can turn around to make sure campaigns are running as you want them to run. On the other hand, you don't really get the excitement of running a campaign and think about what might happen in the next few days or hours or weeks. Because as a marketer, you're mostly used to run so many campaigns at the same time in different countries for different or similar audiences, that the excitement really is limited, I would say. So if you're talking about not direct response or something offline or more brand-related things, you really are doing something probably for the very first time, and that's really, really nice to do.
Yeah. First of all, like we work on a large geography, so we have more than 60 countries that we are operating and making user acquisition. So the best thing is like with our limited budget, it creates wonders, of course. But the worst part is like we do RPG games and strategy games which are targeting a certain type of high ARPP user base. And those people work on a word of mouth most of the time to create a guild and bring their peers and colleagues together. And that point, like direct response doesn't really work well for us. And we always need a bigger impact to make people talk about our games. So that's what I can say.
I echo a lot of what these guys said. Biggest pro for me, if you're a company that's struggling to kind of get off the ground, direct response is really your only ticket to customer acquisition in the most efficient manner, right? So you get immediate results, you lower your acquisition costs, and I think for most companies starting off, this is really the only solution. I mean, it's to generate as much sale as you can. Downside to that, there is a cap to how much you can grow from pure direct response, because the fact of the matter is usually in most markets, your customers are not actively always looking for your product or service, right? And so there is a long-term effect of all the marketing that you're doing. And if you're not optimizing around that, then you're suffering as a result. And you'll limit the total size that your business can grow to.
It sounds like one of the common denominators is real time, right? Like in terms of a benefit of direct response. You know immediately, you know how to measure it, you know what to expect. So if that's the case, why would you ever switch and not do all direct response? What are some of kind of the main drivers to actually do something that's offline or do something that's brand related?
I think for me, like if you run, for instance, ads on Facebook, Google, Snapchat, Instagram, you're just forced to do what the network allows you to do in terms of format, length, resolution of images or videos. So, I mean, the flexibility is really limited. And when I think of offline marketing or brand-related things, whether it's TV or subway ads or just like, I don't know, maybe football ads in the US, there's much more you can do because it operates outside of the online networks. And that also gives you a lot of insights and learnings what you then can apply online as well because you didn't think about it before.
I think that makes sense. I guess one of the other big questions though is kind of, okay, if we're all doing direct response, right? That's what pretty much our entire day has been around. How do you actually make the transition into branding and offline, right? At what point in time, especially if you were saying for a lot of companies that have just begun, right? They've just started, they've really got to go for direct response. How do you know when to actually make that transition into more branding and into more of those evergreen, long-term kind of ad campaigns? Thomas?
Probably when you realize you're addicted to the direct response part. In our case, it's paid acquisition has worked very early on, so like, this is working for us, let's do it. And at some point, we kind of anticipated, like, as Jim said, you can't scale it to the infinity, you need to accompany it. We realized before it happened that we actually need to support it with other things. And it was kind of, as you say, it's a transition. It's not from a day to another, and it was actually tough for us to say, okay, we're gonna start invest money that we're not exactly sure if it's gonna come back. If it's coming back, we're not actually sure when it's gonna come back. And being very used to this immediacy was really a challenge that we say, okay, but we need to build for the future and say, let's start investing in this now because it's probably gonna take us 6 months or a year to actually understand. And that's when we felt we need it in a year, that we say, okay, let's start now. And for us, it was pretty much last year, we're doing only direct response, nothing, and we start building 2 teams. One that is growing the direct response because we still live on it, and one that has way less goals, that is a learning team for the future, an investment team on a longer term. It's hard to say exactly when it is, but if you start seeing direct response peaking in terms of efficiency, that's probably you're just a little bit too late. You should have started about it just before that. Hard to detect, but that's how I would answer.
Yeah, just to build on Thomas's point, I think actually it flows quite naturally because most online channels are not infinitely scalable, right? So there comes a point where you see incremental decreasing returns, and usually that's the point when most companies will take a leap and start doing some tests. And I think in Babbel's case, when we first launched in TV, it's a big step forward, because for the first time you're reaching a mass audience. You're no longer using super hyper-targeted, online, optimizing around CPAs. You sort of have to take a leap of faith. But the benefit to that is actually once you start reaching a mass audience, you see the impact across all of your channels. And we see actually increased efficiency across all of our online channels because, of course, from a consumer perspective, the consumers are out there in the world. There's not an online consumer and an offline consumer. They're one and the same.
So then, for you specifically, I don't know if y'all have seen the Babel Alien Ads. They're pretty awesome. If you haven't seen them yet, hopefully go take a look after this. But maybe you can describe just a little bit. Obviously, you guys got into TV. And so maybe you can describe the ad a little bit and how you chose TV versus maybe some other offline channels.
Yeah, sure. So I think first off, from a brand building perspective, I think the biggest thing that we care about is two things really. One is what are the best channels to gain the biggest reach? Because when you're doing something for longer term, you really want to reach as wide of an audience as you can in order to work on their memory and their associations. And the truth is, if you work on a small audience target, it just doesn't have as big of a long-term impact. So that's number one. And number two is we look for media that is rich media. So media that allows us to do really emotional storytelling. So things that involve sight, sound, etc. And it just so happens that TV basically checks off all the boxes, which is why I think TV is still the primary and biggest channel for brand building across pretty much every industry. So that's why we choose to go with TV for most of our brand building activities. And in terms of the campaign itself, we always start with the consumer, because I think anytime you're doing something that has a more longer term impact, you want to do something that, that is highly relatable, that's highly emotional, that really sticks to people, right? So we usually look for universal insights that can work. Babbel is a global business, and so we always need to make sure that we can make one TV spot that can resonate, not just in Germany, but everywhere across the world. And so in our case, the insight that we arrived on was when you don't speak the language, you feel like an outsider, you feel like an alien, right? And so we developed Creative, where we actually introduce an alien character that is a metaphor for this feeling of alienation when you don't speak the language, right? And this is how we're able to tell our story in a way that resonates with our audience.
Can you imitate that alien for us?
I'm still working on it. Maybe next time.
Y'all have to check it out. I'll do a little, it's like tick, 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 a little bit of that.
It's not bad.
All right, so Aras, what have y'all tried out? What offline channels have y'all kind of picked at, and why'd you choose them?
Well, we started experimenting like 6 years ago on TV, and over the years we tried almost everything, like product placement, editorials in different parts of the world, Turkey, Middle East, Asia, US, celebrity usage, and influencers are part of our deal now. It's always gets almost 20% of our budgets every single launch. So, and by experimenting, we found out that some things work better than others, and in different parts of the world as well. But the main thing is that it creates a great decrease in the CPI. And you almost always have to follow it or co-op with direct response anyway. But if you create a good creative and you try to impact with a big enough budget, we always lived with a very low CPIs, longer terms, LTVs, and also, in addition to that, a lot of word of mouth, which of course increases the lifetime product life cycle of our games. If you look at today, we have games like with more than 4 years of lifetime, which is pretty high for mobile games, and we have coupled with like 6 years now, which is still in top 50 grossing in the world.
Wow.
So it's almost always with know-how and like experimenting and like building on top of it. what you find out and like what you figure out in different markets. But this is for sure. It's always different in different regions. So in Asia, they are used to that. So even if today you start a large campaign in Asia without TV, with direct response, your impact will be not as much as you do in, let's say, in Saudi Arabia, because they are not used to that. For them, it's like amazing to see something on TV in that sense.
So a little bit different than Babbel there, right? Because it sounds like you guys are able to find one insight that actually can be applied pretty much globally. But for you, you have to localize on top of doing the offline.
Yeah, exactly. Like localization in terms of like what we do outside direct response is pretty important, especially in the influencer side as well. I mean, you can have so much trouble with influencers if you don't localize your content or your brief. You have to be, I mean, like they tend to behave very differently in different regions. In Asia, they are very humble, and in US, they are like much more different in a sense that they can go very directly with like vulgar approach and so on.
A little more verbose.
Yeah, and that's okay for them. So it's kind of like very different. If you know your brand and your game, you have to like really tackle them differently. So that's how we found out. We recently tried, for example, influencer plus TV thing. Like we got so many influencers together, and like from each of them, we got the direct response campaign based on their influencer Twitch campaigns. So each of these guys did a Twitch and YouTube, and like we mixed them and put it on TV.
I think there's something that's really relevant in what you're saying is we're here opposing like, oh, you're doing direct response, you're doing the brand campaign. What you seem to say is, actually no, it's when you do the two of it that together that actually combines and actually work. We had this example where we did a bunch of influencers. Most of them failed. The few of them that worked actually repay for the whole party, so that was cool. But we kind of tried to insist on the one that worked for us. When they were doing it again, it didn't work so well. And what we realized is that we could shoot with them follow-ups that we use on direct response. We had particularly this influencer that we put this video that he did specifically for Snapchat there, and it was unbelievable. And it was pure direct response, and it kind of gave us a second. The first campaign was great with this influencer, and we also saw the uplift in that particular country at the time and all. It's kind of, we could roll the ball again on direct response with the insight from that example. And it's not black and white. There's a lot of gray area in between, and it's probably where most of the gold is actually.
There's no doubt that you need both. I think actually if you did 100% brand building for most companies, you wouldn't be able to afford it, and you're probably go out of business by the end of the year. And so you really need a balance of the two, and also in such a competitive marketplace, and the ones that we play in, you need to constantly be harvesting sales, right? And if you're just projecting out to the masses and you're not pushing sales, then your competitors will essentially eat your lunch.
Yeah, most of the time in gaming, I mean, in our case, we have so many, like we have almost like 30 games at the moment, like in different parts of the world. So we don't try to create brands first. That's what differs from non-gaming, in my opinion. Like you guys, for example, they try to build a brand and move on it for over years and years. But in our case, the life cycle of games might be very shorter compared to apps, right? So that in that case, we try not to build a brand, but push the game first and like create the word of mouth. And if the game goes well enough with the like KPIs, then we try to build a brand on top of it. So that's kind of like different in my opinion.
So it almost sounds like based on your vertical, right? So in the gaming sector, starting off with direct response, if it hits, then moving into branding, versus the opposite if you actually have some sort of e-commerce or health or something like that type of business model, to do the opposite maybe, where you have a brand campaign, but then to actually start building upon it, do direct response.
It's very different by vertical, but even within a vertical, different tactics can work for a product and another. And in my particular vertical, we see that one of the key player, one of the biggest player, the app is a brand before it was an app. Like it's a celebrity herself that
Kylie?
actually did, that actually, I don't want to mention competition too much. And then we've got other competitors that actually are extremely strong without building much, purely direct response. They're really good at it, they're doing it good. And it seemed to work for the both of them. And it seems to work for us that are a little bit in between those two situations. So I'm not sure there are recipes that work for that vertical. What's sure is there are failures for some, but even within a vertical, there are things that can work differently. You can make it work your own way.
But so to that point, if you're doing a branding campaign where you don't get immediate results, you can't actually measure is this working or not, then how do you know how to switch it up and to move to direct response? So if you are starting with a branding campaign, when do you know to make the switch? Or when do you know to start building? Do you have to do that immediately? And if so, that's a lot of budget. How do you convince somebody internally?
So I think, at least for us, we try to make sure to set some boundaries how we can measure offline campaigns. So for instance, we set up an offline campaign here in Berlin in subway stations in March with big posters, basically, telling people what ADA is, what ADA can do for you, and try to use some German-specific wordplay so they know, okay, it's probably a Berlin-based company, and it seems to be a product I understand and I would use. And what we already know is if we run a campaign, for instance, on Facebook that creates 10,000 installs per month, what's the organic uplift that creates? And if we look at an isolated level, we know, okay, maybe the uplift is 30 to 35%. So everything on top of that must have come specifically from a Berlin-based campaign, for instance. And this is how we try to isolate specific parts. So we basically subtract all the direct response installs or traffic from the total ones, and then we can roughly assume what the impact was. On top of that, we try to see if we have any additional brand search, for instance, brand search in, on Google, for instance, on other search engines in the App Store. This is how we try to track the impact, and we use very specific measures, also trying to use hashtags, for instance, sometimes on posters to know, okay, if people actually tweet it, post it on Facebook or Instagram.
Because we're beginner in this game, we try to replicate what, so we do this as well, but in a way what I see is we're trying to treat this channel as direct response channel. We're trying to measure exactly the impact it has and my baseline and so on. At some point I wish we'll reach a stage where we're actually even beyond that and not only measuring as a direct response channel and seeing the organic baseline, because there's a lot more to it that you don't necessarily see if those campaigns are small, but one thing we're looking at, so we do like you, we look at the uplift, we look at the brand search, something that's really interesting to look at is how it is affecting my normal direct response channels. And that's why it's critical to have both running at the same time, because the incrementality might actually come from that side and not necessarily directly from the impact of the campaign. And it might not be so obvious. If you don't do it big enough, this effect is not there. It's kind of tricky to get, can be on the very long term too. But yeah, we still have to grow in that direction, and we very much treat it as a direct response channel for now, which is fun, but it's not the whole story.
I don't think actually there's any company that is doing for any one particular piece of creative 100% brand building. I mean, maybe like the Coca-Colas of this world are doing it, but even like in our creatives, you know, we spend, let's say in a 30-second ad, we spend 20 seconds telling a story very much about brand building, and then we have an end frame, right? And with our end frame, we have a call to action, we have a very clear call out to our logos, right? So these are typical direct response elements that we still incorporate, right? And also from a tracking perspective, we're also not at a point where we are not treating a channel as purely not direct response. I mean, TV, we are also tracking from a direct response perspective, just like you guys are. And
I never doubted you on that.
Yeah.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, no, exactly. But I think the point is it's actually really hard to remove the two, because ultimately all marketing works from a direct response perspective as well as from a long-term brand building perspective.
I guess to that point though, right? For a lot of people in the room, you're doing only direct response because you may be a pretty new company, right? And that's what you can get at quickly with the least amount of money, least amount of time. Why invest in brand then, right? If you have to do both, which is what we kind of just decided, then why do the branding? What can you really say behind it? And then especially if it costs so much more money, right? You're pretty much all saying TV is a must, and that's obviously pretty expensive. How do you convince internally that this is something worth pursuing?
I think specifically for us, as we're a health app, we basically provide a service who are in need of healthcare at the very moment they see an ad. But this just applies to a very small part of the population, right? So if I would ask around how many people are here feeling unwell, it's maybe just 1 or 2 of them who would
How many
directly
people
need
feel unwell? Anybody?
who would directly are in need of ADA, but the other ones maybe will feel unwell or definitely one day, and then they are in need of our app. And it's basically at least how we treat the difference between direct response and brand marketing is that direct response should really, as the name itself says, give you a direct response right away. Whereas brand is for us a long-term thinking that, okay, we need to think of the other 99%, how we reach them, right? I mean, this is very often the case when you see an ad basically on TV and it's about food, but you've just eaten, you're definitely not interested in buying another piece of whatever, cake or something. But you might be interested to do that tomorrow, right? And it's still the same audience, it's still the same target group, but it's just the wrong time with direct response. So this is something that brand building can definitely outbalance, at least for us.
Well, being a Korean company, you can imagine we have tons of processes for TV or influencer. And if it's like a country we already tackled and experimented, that's easy. Like we don't have to do it again and over and again. But if it's a new region, that's something that I remember the time where we put the TVC on for 30 seconds. We track exact 30 seconds of the CCU, see if they are coming back, and following the next hour, so if the installs are coming back, and so on. So it's a process, to be honest. But the best thing is that we are an open company to experimenting, and I think the mobile gaming is one of the parts of this industry that experiments most. So as a result, we always try to go small first, try with I was working for Unilever before, so I was working for L'Oreal. So when you do something like that, you do for millions of dollars for a couple of months, because tracking the KPIs takes another 6 months, right? But in this case, you can track immediately at least part of it. So that gives you the courage and okay, this works. Let's try it with more money. Let's try it with more money. That's what we approach this, especially in the new countries that we are trying to do.
But how do you pitch it internally?
It's really hard. I mean, you guys brought up a lot of really good points. I think there is a lot of good intuition and also a lot of industry research around why it makes a lot of sense. I think you would be hard-pressed to find an industry where the majority of the customers buy immediately for any product or service, right? So there is always a long-term effect of your activities, whether you like it or not. I mean, we've done consumer research studies to look at language learners and to see, is it an impulse buy? Do people see an ad and immediately they're like, oh yeah, I'll download an app and learn a language? And we find overwhelmingly it's not. This is something that people have kind of in the back of their heads, potentially for years, right? And then there's this one trigger that happens. It can come from anything. Your friend just came back from Spain and was talking about a trip there, and it makes you, have this desire to want to learn Spanish all of a sudden. And so it can really come from anywhere. And the question is, at that point, when that trigger happens, what are all of the activities that have been done beforehand so that you're the brand that comes to mind and you're within the consideration set? If you haven't done anything up to that point, then you're sort of relying on search and word of mouth or recommendations to get you into that consideration set.
Yeah. Well, so one of my favorite as I was researching all of the different companies I have sitting here, Ada Health actually won a Cannes Lion for one of their ads, which is pretty cool. And as we're wrapping up the time here, I actually wanted to ask you guys, who's doing a really good job, not just in direct response, but building their brand at the same time? What company would you say is kind of that star that's really leading the way? And you can't use your own.
That's hard then. So I think it's definitely those companies who have a very big local presence. So for those companies, that really have an urge to do something locally. I think we are all excluded from that because you can use us from anywhere in the world. But if you think of a brand such as Foodora or Deliveroo, you know, they don't work in small villages. They have a big presence in big cities usually. Same with like transportation companies like BVG. I think BVG and Foodora, I think in my opinion, do a very great job, especially in Berlin, because they have such a long-term presence, just doing offline ads, or mostly doing offline ads, where you basically can see entire streets paved with their posters, and that's really something that sticks to your mind. That would be my candidate, yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't too sure what I was about to answer this question, but I'd say probably my competitor Kayla is doing an amazing job, and a few things we see she's doing. We also see some of the results that her conversion is incredible, and we see some things she does without like thinking how I'm going to make this back, but eventually we see how the ball rolls bigger all the time. She was featured on the WWDC at Apple, just doing a workout for everybody. And it is a thing, like maybe the developers, they're not a public at all. Like it's a woman app, not really nerdy. She's still doing it, and all these things they accumulate, and she's doing it like well with the energy and stuff. I have to say I'm very impressed. But not only because it's a competition. I mean, she's really doing it neatly.
Well, Karim was here, so I think like in the Middle East region, Karim does a great job, in my opinion, replacing Uber in most of the countries. So I think for me, like what they do is amazing. So there are few countries few regions that like Uber is not dominant. It's because of Karim, to be honest, for me.
All right, shout out Rakesh.
Yeah, I'll give a very specific example. So I think actually the best brands that do well in this space are the ones who are able to connect emotionally with their consumers, because emotion is actually the most strongest currency, I think, for long-term impact of any sort of creative work. And Spotify, I think, is a good example of a brand that's recently been doing some really interesting stuff in that space. So not sure if you guys have seen the ads that they've put in local markets, but they, for example, put one in the UK shortly after Brexit that said something like, for the 3,000 people that streamed "It's the End of the World as We Know It" the day after the Brexit, hang in there, right? So to me, this is an example of a brand that is really trying to connect emotionally and really understands kind of the situation that their consumers are in, right? And I think for me, this is really the measure of when I see a company who is really operating at that level. It's do they really like intimately understand who their consumers are, and are they able to talk to them in a way that elicits a very strong emotional response?
Awesome. Well, on that note, do we have time for some Q&A? Some brief Q&A. Does anybody have a question for our panelists?
Are any of you guys using some of the traditional measurements for like OH or broadcast, like unaided recognition, aided recognition, share of voice, anything like that? Or is it all keying off of performance and direct response just migrated into the traditional channels?
So we use a combination. We are looking at direct response of pretty much every channel that we're operating in. But beyond that, we are also measuring the more sort of top of the funnel metrics, so awareness, preference, brand profile, consideration, et cetera, right? So I think for a direct response marketer, it's really hard to wrap your head around these metrics because they don't correspond directly to financial results, right? But these are typically the leading indicators of long-term performance.
Great. Any other questions? We'll wrap it up. I know you're ready to come on stage. But if we could just get a quick round of applause for our awesome panelists.